HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Beatles 100, 100 Pivotal Moments in Beatles History, by John Borack, read by Keith Sellon-Wright. Forward. When I commenced writing my first Beatles-related book, in mid-2009, I felt extremely fortunate. Having been a fan of the Beatles since the tender age of 5, I had almost literally cut my teeth on their music, so being given the opportunity to chronicle the life and times of one of the legendary Fab Four was a thrill, to say the least. The peerless music of the Beatles, as well as their solo efforts, certainly became an integral part of my formative years, as it was for millions of others. At age 12, my band, the Solar Reflection, it was the 70s, okay, took a whack, quite literally, unfortunately, at recording Get Back and Band on the Run, with the results best left unheard by those with functioning ears. The previous year I had been called to the principal's office for having the gall to bring a copy of Wings' High, High, High to a 5th-grade dance. This unwanted dust-up with the school administration was due to my teacher mistaking the word funky for another somewhat more threatening F-word being sung by Paul. Apparently she had glossed right over the "I want you to lie on the bed, get you ready for my body gun" stanza, the "I'm gonna do it to you" lyric, and the not-so-subtle drug reference in the chorus. In high school, while other kids were reporting on literary giants such as Steinbeck and Shakespeare, this Beatles obsessive in the making penned a book report for a freshman English course on Hunter Davies' 1968 biography, The Beatles. My instructor, Mrs. Perlman, begrudgingly gave me an A- on the report, but scrawled at the top of the title page, "You'll never get anywhere reading stuff like this, John." Shades of John Lennon's Aunt Mimi and her famous "A guitar's all right, John, but you'll never earn your living by it" comment. When my daughter Kayla was an infant, I would regularly rock her to sleep while singing Beatles songs. Even though my voice is no great shakes. Okay, it's terrible. The sound of me whisper-singing Beatles ballads never failed to lull her to sleep. I seem to recall "And I Love Her" being one tune that particularly soothed her as she would drift off to dreamland. From that seemingly innocuous beginning all those years ago came a passion that Kayla and I have grown to share, a love of the music of the Beatles, and especially Paul McCartney. We've attended Beatles conventions together, where she has met folks such as George Harrison's sister Louise and former Wingsman Denny Laine, listened to countless hours of Beatles music in the car, attended numerous Beatles tribute band gigs, and purchased Beatles-related birthday and holiday gifts for each other nearly every year. The two of us have watched the Fab Four's films together, including an ancient VHS copy of Magical Mystery Tour I unearthed in our garage a few years back. Her reaction to the movie? "Dad, that was weird." She's not wrong. As Kayla hit her teenage years, I watched and listened with immense pride as she sang "Let It Be," "Here Comes the Sun," and John Lennon's "Grow Old With Me" at various local concerts and community events. But for me, and it's a safe bet that Kayla would agree, the highlight of our dual Beatle fandom has to be the 3 times we've seen Paul McCartney in concert together. In Las Vegas in 2011, and at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles in 2014, and again on July 13, 2019. The first 2 shows were certainly memorable, but McCartney's most recent LA appearance is the one I think we'll look back on as something very special. One for the ages, as they say. As the show began with the rush of the ever-so-familiar guitar chord that opens A Hard Day's Night, I glanced over at Kayla and saw that she had tears streaming down her cheeks. As she reached for my hand, I sensed these were happy tears. I smiled slightly, squeezed her hand, and wondered what the evening would hold in store for us. Would it be solely a nostalgia trip, with the stories I'd heard of Paul's failing old man voice proving to be true? Would we be disappointed in the 77-year-old former Beatle if he could no longer cut the mustard on stage? As it turns out, my fears were allayed before the show even reached the halfway mark. The set list was strong and varied, with the 3 new songs from Egypt Station sounding fresh and slotting in quite nicely alongside Beatles and solo Paul chestnuts, such as Band on the Run, From Me to You, the explosive, literally, Live and Let Die, and I've Just Seen a Face. Happily, McCartney's voice showed little signs of the wear and tear we'd been warned about, especially given that this was the final night of his tour. As a matter of fact, one chill-inducing moment during the evening, and there were several for me, was a little falsetto vocal bit Paul tossed in toward the close of the iconic Maybe I'm Amazed. I teared up a little, and it was at that point I realized this was no ordinary rock show we were witnessing. Simply put, it was magical. As the 38-song set ebbed and flowed, songs such as Got to Get You Into My Life, Call Me Back Again, both powered by the addition of a horn section, Let It Be, Obla-Dee, Obla-Da, I've Got a Feeling, and Let 'Em In, were rapturously received by the sellout crowd. I stole looks at Kayla every now and again and saw that she was clapping, happily singing along, and getting lost in the music, just like her dad did and still does. Because, you see, the bulk of these songs were not simply a part of my life. In many ways, these songs were my life. After the obligatory Hey Jude as the final song and more wild applause, McCartney and his band returned to the stage for a storming encore of Birthday. Then the moment many in the crowd had hoped, wished, and maybe even prayed for came to pass. "We've got a surprise for us, a surprise for you, a surprise for everyone," McCartney told the crowd, raising the already high energy level to a fever pitch. "Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Ringo Starr." As the 50-some-odd thousand concert-goers collectively lost their minds, Kayla and I both burst into tears. And as Paul welcomed Ringo to the stage with a kiss and an affectionate, "I love you, man," we realized we were witnessing history. After Ringo joined Paul and the band behind the drums for spirited run-throughs of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Helter Skelter, it was time to close out the evening with the Golden Slumbers, Carry That Weight, The End medley from Abbey Road. As McCartney positioned himself at the piano and plaintively crooned the opening line, "Once there was a way to get back homeward," tears flowed for me yet again. 2019 was a year of loss and challenges for my family, and those thoughts, intermingled with the emotion of having listened to nearly 3 hours' worth of songs that are so damned important to me, made me weep unashamedly. It was both cleansing and emotionally uplifting, and the fact that my daughter was standing alongside me at that moment was the icing on the cake. After we arrived back home, I went into Kayla's room to say good night and ask her a question that had been on my mind. "Honey, I know why you were crying when Ringo came on stage," I began. "But why did you start to cry right at the beginning of the concert?" My daughter looked up at me and said, "Because I was just so happy I was able to share it with you. Bright are the stars that shine, dark is the sky. I know this love of mine will never die." Thank you for everything, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. John M. Borack, September 2020. Chapter 1. John Lennon Meets Paul McCartney. I just thought, well, he looks good and he seems like a great lead singer to me. Of course, he had his glasses off, so he really looked suave. Paul McCartney on his first meeting with John Lennon. I ruined Paul's life. He could have been a doctor. He could have been somebody. John Lennon. This is where it all began. On a 1957 summer's day in Liverpool, England, two teenage boys, one with an artistic bent and a rather large chip on his rebellious shoulder, and the other a somewhat pudgy, self-conscious boy who tended to obey his father, met for the first time. Although neither of them could possibly realize it as they initially bonded over their love of American rock and roll, the seemingly innocuous introduction of John Lennon and Paul McCartney at the Woolton Parish Church garden fete would eventually change the face of popular music forever. Lennon's local skiffle outfit, the Quarrymen, or the Quarrymen, depending on whom one believes, was one of the featured performers at the fete on Saturday, July 6, 1957, sharing the outdoor space with a Liverpool police dog display and the band of the Cheshire Yeomanry. Ivan Vaughan, a mutual friend of Lennon and Paul McCartney, brought Paul along to the fete in order to introduce him to John. After hearing John and his mates bash out some tunes, Paul was suitably impressed. I thought, wow, he's good. So backstage I was singing a couple of songs I'd known. I used to know all the words to Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock and a few others, and it was pretty cool in those days to know the words to that. John didn't know the words to many songs, so I was valuable. I wrote up a few words and showed him how to play 20 Flight Rock and another one, I think. Anyway, that was my first introduction. Incidentally, Beatles historian and author Mark Lewison suggests that the Woolton fete might not have been the first time the two met, and that Lennon and McCartney had even exchanged a few words, possibly in 1956. Not only are there photos still in existence of the Quarrymen at the Woolton fete, one that shows the band planted on a flatbed truck, as well as the iconic photo of a checked-shirted John at the mic with a guitar, but a tape of the Quarrymen's show has survived. It sold for approximately $120,000 in 1994, but was deemed to be of too poor quality to be used as part of the Beatles anthology. Years later, John Lennon remembered the baby-faced McCartney on that fateful day as seeming very young, but also very talented. In addition, as John told Beatles biographer Hunter Davies, he also looked like Elvis. I dug him. A few weeks after the Woolton fete, Paul was invited to join the Quarrymen, and he played his first gig with the band on October 18, 1957, at the new Clubmoor Hall in the North End of Liverpool. John and Paul may have dug each other, but Paul's father, Jim, didn't share Paul's enthusiasm about his son's newfound pal. "He'll get you into trouble, son," were Jim McCartney's exact words. But despite Jim Mack's warnings, the Lennon-McCartney relationship would blossom both personally and professionally, with the two young men beginning to write tunes together and eventually bonding, albeit in an unspoken fashion, over the tragic loss of their respective mothers. Paul: I don't pretend to have had as painful a childhood as John. My memories are very pleasant. I'm sure that's one reason why I became the warm side of Lennon-McCartney. Paul would soon convince John that the Quarrymen should take on a hot-shot young guitarist and schoolmate of Paul's called George Harrison, and the rest, as they say, is quite literally history. The significance of their partnership and the magic it was to create was certainly not lost on John Lennon or Paul McCartney. I think it's possible for John and Paul to have created the same thing with two other guys, John told Playboy shortly before his death in 1980. It may not have been possible for George and Ringo to have created it without John and Paul. And Paul was upfront about his feelings on the matter as well, as he told journalist Barry Miles, "John and I were two of the luckiest people in the 20th century to have found each other. The partnership, the mix, was incredible." Indeed. Chapter 2. America greets the Fab Four in 1964. Beatlemania ensues. So this is America. They all seem to be out of their minds. Ringo Starr, 1964. By the end of 1963, the British public had been knocked on their collective backsides by the Beatles' songs, style, and witty charm. The band had begun making major inroads in Europe, having performed multiple gigs in Sweden and France in October 1963 and early 1964, respectively, and next on the agenda was to attempt to win over the United States. But the U.S. would be tough, and the band knew it. Capitol Records had passed on the Beatles' 1963 singles in the United States, and while smaller labels such as Swan and Vee-Jay had released them, the response was effectively nil. But eventually Capitol Records was made aware of the frenzy surrounding the band overseas and deigned to release the Beatles' latest single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, on December 26, 1963. It was only after all the publicity and the Beatlemania in Europe that Capitol Records decided, "Oh, we will have them," George Harrison remembered in the Beatles anthology. They put out I Want to Hold Your Hand as our first single, but in fact it was our fourth. As the single rocketed to the #1 spot on both the Cashbox and Billboard charts, plans were afoot for the Beatles to travel to the United States in early February 1964 to appear on The Ed Sullivan Show, as well as to play a few live shows on the East Coast. Still, the band was a bit apprehensive as to how they would be received. On the Beatles' initial flight to New York, Paul McCartney asked, "They've got their own groups. What are we going to give them that they don't already have?" He later reminisced, "We'd gone to #1 there with I Want to Hold Your Hand, but we had no idea how big we were out there. So we stepped off the plane, and the crowd was enormous. The noise was deafening. On a scale of 1 to 10, that was about 100 in terms of the shock of it." The deafening noise, a.k.a. thousands of frenzied teenagers, was the sound of Beatlemania, which would soon become a worldwide phenomenon. Capitol admittedly spent some major dollars promoting the Fab Four's first U.S. visit, but as Voyle Gilmore, vice president of Capitol Records, said, "There was a lot of hype, but all the hype in the world isn't going to sell a bad product." Aside from the group's fresh, new, and exciting musical sound, John, Paul, George, and Ringo's healthy irreverence and playfulness helped to provide America, still reeling from the assassination of President John F. Kennedy the previous November, with a much-needed breath of fresh air. "Being cheeky chappies saved our arses on many occasions, because the guys from the press had come to bury us," Ringo recalled. Hordes of media followed the Beatles every step, with McCartney in particular doing his best to accommodate them. Former Beatles press officer Tony Barrow said, "Paul turned out to have such a natural flair for public relations. He seemed to know instinctively how to work the media to the best advantage. Paul was the one-man Barnum and Bailey Beatle." The band's U.S. debut, Meet the Beatles, was released on January 20th, 1964, and contained 9 tracks from the previous year's With the Beatles LP, along with I Saw Her Standing There, from Please Please Me, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and This Boy. In short order, the band's music would become all-pervasive in the United States. During the first week in April 1964, the Beatles had the top 5 singles on the Billboard charts. A week later, a staggering 14 of the top 100 songs in the nation belonged to the Fab Four. As America showed their love for the Beatles, the boys in the band were similarly as enthusiastic about the U.S., particularly the music. The thing is, every bit of music we loved came from America, whether it was blues, country and western, rock and roll, all of that. To us, it was from Valhalla, Paul McCartney said in 2016. And so you go there and you can see it in all the early footage. Just us listening to ourselves on the radio. We're just thrilled by it all. McCartney has called the Beatles' arrival and overwhelming success in America the greatest fantasy ever. How did it happen? Ringo Starr once put it very succinctly. The gods were on our side. Chapter 3. Pete Best relieved of drumming duties. Ringo Starr joins the Beatles. When you're young, it's not a nice thing to be kicked out of a band, and there's no nice way of doing it. George Harrison. Pete Best officially became a member of the Beatles on August 12, 1960. On August 16, 1962, he was informed by Beatles manager Brian Epstein that his services as the Beatles drummer were no longer required. During those 2 years, the Beatles played tons of gigs with Best in England and Germany and recorded 15 tracks for Decca Records as part of an audition in January 1962. Why Best was booted from the group as they were on the cusp of success has long been the subject of much conjecture. According to Beatles insider Peter Brown, Best joined the band in 1960 out of desperation more than desire. The Beatles' then-manager Alan Williams had arranged for the band to travel to Hamburg, and they were without a permanent drummer, which reportedly led to Paul McCartney asking Best to join the group at the 11th hour. Over the next 2 years, Best would gain a measure of popularity with Beatles fans, due in no small part to his moody good looks, and would often front the band on their cover of Peppermint Twist, with McCartney switching over to drums. But behind the scenes there was trouble brewing. As Paul McCartney explained in the Beatles anthology, "I used to get on Pete's case a bit. He'd often stay out all night. He got to know a stripper, and they were boyfriend and girlfriend. She didn't finish work until 4 in the morning, so he'd stay up with her and roll back at about 10 in the morning and be going to bed when we were starting work. I think that had something to do with a rift starting." In addition, over time, it became obvious that Best was a very limited drummer who played the same leaden, four-on-the-floor beat on most every song, offering little in the way of imaginative or even rudimentary drum fills. In 1971, while guesting on a New York radio program, John Lennon was asked by a listener, "How come you suddenly threw Pete Best out of the group?" John replied simply, "Because he couldn't play very well." The caller asked, "Is that why?" And John shot back, "Sure, why else?" In another interview, the always forthright Lennon admitted, "We were pretty sick of Pete Best, because he was a lousy drummer. He never improved, you know. We were always going to dump him when we could find a decent drummer." After the Beatles were signed to a recording contract with EMI, they tracked 4 songs as part of a test run in June 1962. Producer George Martin found Best's performance lacking and wanted to replace him with a session drummer for an upcoming recording date scheduled for September 1962. A cursory listen to the version of Love Me Do featuring Best on the Beatles anthology finds the tempo varying wildly. For his part, George Martin insisted, "I never suggested that Pete Best must go. All I said was that for the purposes of the Beatles' first record, I would rather use a session man." Perhaps the other 3 Beatles got nervous and saw their recording contract possibly slipping away, or maybe they had been wanting Best out for some time and Martin's lack of confidence in the drummer helped seal the deal. The possibility exists that there was some other unspoken reason, but one thing was clear. They wanted Best out of the band, and they asked Brian Epstein to do the dirty work. Best told author Philip Norman that on August 16, 1962, "I went bouncing into Brian's office. As soon as I saw him, I could tell there was something up. He said, 'The boys want you out of the group. They don't think you're a good enough drummer.'" Later, in a letter to a friend, Epstein explained, "Pete was too conventional. Didn't fit well as a drummer or a man." "It was a big issue at the time, how we dumped Pete," Paul McCartney said in the Beatles anthology, "and I do feel sorry for him because of what he could have been on to, but if he wasn't up to the mark, slightly in our eyes and definitely in the producer's eyes, then there was no choice. But it was still very difficult." Speaking about Best's sacking, Beatles scholar and historian Mark Lewison noted, "It was the most underhand, unfortunate, and unforgivable chapter in the Beatles' rise to monumental power." Another issue may have been the fact that Best was something of a loner off stage and not considered to be one of the boys. George Martin opined, "While the other three were very unified in their performance and enthusiasm, Pete did not seem to be a true part of the group." John Lennon confirmed this in a 1974 interview. "Pete was a harmless guy, but he was not quick. All of us had quick minds, but he never picked that up." It had already been determined prior to Best's ouster that fellow Liverpudlian Ringo Starr would be joining the Beatles. He was friends with the boys and had sat in and recorded with them on a few occasions over the past 2 years in Germany and the UK. In addition to an outgoing personality, he also possessed the advanced drumming skills that Pete Best did not. "He played one way and I played another," Ringo offered. "When I joined the band, the sound and the rhythm changed. It gave the Beatles a new feel." Ringo's debut with the Beatles took place on August 18, 1962, at the annual dance of the Port Sunlight Horticultural Society. George Harrison, who had lobbied the hardest for Starr to join the band, said, "It will seem difficult for a few weeks, but I think that the majority will soon be taking Ringo for granted." Speaking about the crowd at that fateful initial gig, Starr later offered, "Half of them hated me and half of them loved me. It seemed the ones who hated him initially spoke the loudest, though, and after enduring some hostility from Pete Best loyalists during the gig, George Harrison eventually told them to fuck off and received a post-show black eye for his efforts." After that less than auspicious start, Ringo would join the band in the studio the following month to record their first single, Love Me Do. Now that the Beatles had the backbeat that couldn't be shaken, there would be no stopping them. "You can hear the difference on the anthology tapes," Paul McCartney said. "When Ringo joins us, we get a bit more kick, a few more imaginative breaks, and the band settles. He just fitted into the group like a glove. No one could beat Ringo." For Ringo Starr, the Beatles were not only a musical match made in heaven, but a personal fit as well. "I had to join them as people as well as a drummer," he once said. "And I felt suddenly like I had 3 brothers." Chapter 4. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band ushers in the Summer of Love. We decided we would try to make our next record something special. We pushed boundaries and tried at every turn to come up with new ideas that we hoped would surprise people. Instead of now looking for catchy singles, it was more like writing your novel. Paul McCartney. We can make sounds that no one has ever heard before. John Lennon to producer George Martin. 1967's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band found the Beatles assuming the guise of a fictional group at the suggestion of Paul McCartney. "Let's not be ourselves," McCartney said, urging the other Beatles to join him in creating alter egos. "We were getting a little bit fed up of being the Beatles," Paul explained, "and I felt we were getting trapped in this whole idea of what kind of songs does John do, what does George do, Paul does the ballads. It was all getting so bloody predictable. I said, why don't we pretend we're another band? Make up a name for it and make up an identity so we can make a whole album from the point of view of this other band." Although John Lennon is generally looked upon as the outlandish left-field Beatle, releasing an album featuring a cover with full-frontal nudity of you and your girlfriend will certainly put those thoughts in people's heads, Paul felt that he was the one who was more in tune with his far-out side at the time. "The funny thing is, there was a time when I was the avant-garde one in the Beatles, around the time of Sgt. Pepper, because that album was largely my influence," Paul said. "I was trying to get everyone in the group to be sort of farther out." Of course, Paul has spent many years attempting to convince the world at large that he was the original avant-garde Beatle, but that's another story. George Harrison also saw far-out, non-pop influences seeping into the Beatles' sphere during the time of Pepper. That was the environment in the band. Everybody was very open to bringing in new ideas. We were listening to all sorts of things. Stockhausen, avant-garde music, whatever. And most of it made its way onto our records.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?